The worst part of loneliness isn't the silence of the house. It's when the silence starts to live inside you. It took me years to understand that. At the beginning of my marriage to Renato, everything seemed alive. We laughed at anything, shared silly plans in the middle of the night, made promises looking at the bedroom ceiling as if the future were simple. And maybe, back then it really was. But time has a strange way of changing things without asking permission. First came the overtime at work. Then the trips. Then the exhaustion. When I realized it, our conversations had turned into to-do lists. Did you pay the bill? Did the technician come? I'll be late today. And that was it. The house was still beautiful. The garden was still well kept. The photos on the walls still showed a happy couple smiling on beaches and at birthdays. To those looking from the outside, our life seemed perfect. But nobody saw the emptiness hidden between one room and another. I woke up alone almost every day. Renato left too early. At night, when he came back, it seemed like he carried the whole world on his shoulders. He barely ate dinner properly. Sometimes he'd fall asleep on the sofa with his laptop open on his lap. And I pretended to understand. In truth, I really did understand. That was the problem. I knew he worked for us. I knew he was tired. I knew that adult life no longer resembled those silly romances we imagine when we're younger. But knowing all this didn't make my heart feel any less abandoned. As the months passed, I started creating small routines just to fill the silence. I'd leave the television on without paying attention. I'd make coffee late at night. I'd look out the second-floor window at the empty street while the rain slowly trickled down the glass. Sometimes I wondered when was the last time someone had truly looked at me. Not out of politeness. Not out of habit. But genuinely. You know when you start to feel invisible in your own home? That's exactly how it was. And the scariest thing wasn't the sadness. It was the fact that I'd already gotten used to it. The worst part wasn't being alone, it was realizing I'd gotten used to it. I remember the day I first thought that sentence. I was sitting in the kitchen, holding a cup of already cold coffee, listening to the distant sound of cars passing outside. The house seemed too big for just one person. It was at that moment that I realized something inside me was changing. It wasn't anger towards Renato, nor a lack of love. It was an emotional exhaustion that was hard to explain. As if I'd been living on autopilot for too long. The days began to repeat themselves in an almost cruel way. Monday felt like Wednesday. Wednesday felt like Sunday. I'd blink, and another week had gone by. And in the midst of this suffocating routine, I still tried to convince myself that everything was okay. Because sometimes, admitting that we're unhappy is scarier than continuing to suffer in silence. I didn't imagine that everything would start to change just when someone new appeared in the house next door. And honestly, if someone had told me back then how much it would affect me, I would have laughed. Or maybe I would have cried. The moving truck arrived on a Tuesday morning. I remember because I was watering the plants on the balcony when I heard the sound of boxes being unloaded at the house next door. For months, that house had remained empty, silent, almost forgotten at the end of the street. And, for some reason, seeing movement there stirred something in me. Maybe curiosity. Maybe just a desire to feel something different. I discreetly watched as some men carried furniture, vases, and appliances. In the midst of the commotion, I saw him for the first time. He must have been a little over 20 years old. Tall, with slightly messy dark hair, a simple t-shirt, and a tired smile, clearly trying to juggle 1,000 things at once. At another point in my life, I might not have even noticed. But I did. He thanked everyone politely, helped carry the heavier boxes, and, unlike most people these days, seemed truly present in the moment. He wasn't glued to his phone. He didn't seem rushed. There was something light about him, and that caught my attention more than it should have. When he noticed me watching from the balcony, he smiled from afar and waved. "Hi. Sorry about the mess." The reaction was so spontaneous that I even stumbled. "Don't worry, moving is like that." He laughed in a simple, sincere way. I hope I don't drive you crazy with noise today. You. I found it curious to hear that. It had been a long time since anyone had looked at my house and imagined a life happening inside. I smiled back, trying to seem indifferent. I think we survived. Then I went inside quickly, as if I needed to escape the strange feeling that little encounter had left in me. But the rest of the day passed differently. For the first time in a long time, there was movement on the street. Soft music coming from the house next door. Sounds of footsteps. Doors opening and closing. Small, common noises that, somehow, broke the suffocating silence I had become accustomed to. That night, while Renato answered emails on his laptop without even properly touching dinner, I found myself looking out the kitchen window at the light on in the neighboring house. Ridiculous, I know. But it was as if that new presence had brought color to a street that had been gray for far too long. In the following days, we began to cross paths frequently. First, it was a quick good morning while I was out to buy bread. Then a short conversation about the absurd heat of that week. Another morning, he appeared holding a package that had been mistakenly delivered to his house. I think this is yours. I smiled, taking the box. Thank you, again. Lucas, he said, extending his hand. Helena. The touch was quick, polite. But strange how some people arrive carrying an energy that's hard to explain. Lucas had that calm way of someone who still saw the world without so much harshness. He paid attention when someone spoke. He asked questions. He listened to the answers. Simple things. But things I hadn't found in my own home for a long time. He had that light way of someone who still believed in people, and that disarmed me. Because near him I realized how cold I had become inside. Not out of malice. Out of survival. And perhaps it was precisely there, in the simplest and most innocent encounters, that something began to change inside me without me realizing it. The conversation started in the simplest way possible. Short. Innocent. Almost forgettable. But it was precisely these small things that came to occupy a huge space within me. Sometimes Lucas would appear at the gate when I was returning from the market. Need help? Before I could answer, he would already be grabbing one of the heaviest bags. On other days, it was just a quick exchange of words at the end of the afternoon. Silly comments about the weather, about the neighbor's dog barking incessantly, about how that street became too quiet after 10 o'clock. Nothing extraordinary. And perhaps that's exactly why it marked me so much. There was no pressure. There were no expectations. Just presence. Something so simple, but that I hadn't felt in years. Renato continued to grow more and more distant. Even when he was physically at home, he seemed absent. We would have dinner together without really talking. Sometimes I'd tell him something about my day, and he'd answer without taking his eyes off his phone. I understand. That's good. It was like talking to someone who had emotionally left a long time ago. And then, outside that empty routine, there was Lucas. Someone who looked me in the eyes when I spoke. Someone who asked, "And you, how are you really doing?" It seems like a simple question, doesn't it? But when was the last time someone really wanted to hear the answer? One night, the power went out on the whole street after a heavy rain. I was sitting on the porch trying to enjoy some of the cool breeze when I saw Lucas leaning against the wall that divided our houses. "I think the universe decided to force everyone to slow down today," he joked. I ended up laughing. It had been a long time since a laugh had come out so naturally. He moved a little closer, holding a small flashlight in his hand. "Have you lived here for a long time?" "Almost 8 years. And do you like it here?" I took a few seconds before answering. "I think I used to like it more." He looked at me attentively, as if he had perceived something hidden in the subtext of my answer. But he didn't insist. And that touched me too. Lucas wasn't intrusive. He didn't ask too many questions. He seemed to understand people's limits. The conversation that night lasted almost an hour. We talked about old movies, trips we never took, songs that marked phases of our lives. I discovered that he had come from another city for work and still knew few people there. "It must be strange to start over alone," I said. He gave a small smile. "Sometimes it is. But maybe some people will show up to make us feel less lost." I don't know why that phrase kept echoing inside me. Maybe because I was lost too. In the following days, I began to realize something I had tried to deny at first. I waited for those moments. I waited to hear his gate opening. I waited to find Lucas on the sidewalk. I waited for those quick conversations that made my day seem less heavy. And the worst part is that I didn't even realize when it had stopped being just friendliness. I smiled more in 5 minutes talking to him than in months within my marriage. This realization came as guilt. A silent guilt, difficult to admit even to myself. Because nothing wrong was happening. Nothing explicit. Nothing that crossed a line. But emotionally, I knew something had already begun. One Friday night, Renato called to say he was traveling again. 3 more days away. I hung up the phone, staring at the dark living room. No surprise. No argument. No reaction. Just that familiar emptiness slowly returning. That's when I heard soft music coming from the house next door. And for the first time in a long time, the silence didn't seem so suffocating. The changes began so subtly that, at first, I didn't even notice. It was gradual. First, I started taking better care of myself. I started wearing perfume at home again, even without a reason. I swapped the baggy clothes I used to wear for light dresses that had been forgotten at the back of the closet for years. One morning, while looking at myself in the bathroom mirror, I realized it had been a long time since I'd tried to truly see myself. I simply existed. I woke up. I tidied the house. I waited for the day to end. Like someone living an automatic life. And then, without realizing it, something inside me had awakened again. It wasn't exactly about Lucas. Or, at least that's what I kept repeating to myself. But the truth is, after he appeared, I started to notice how much I had disappeared within my own marriage. Renato remained distant. His messages were quick, objective, almost businesslike. "I'll arrive Sunday. Meeting delayed. Don't wait up for me." And I read all that without feeling anything but a profound weariness. The strangest thing was realizing that I no longer suffered as before. For a long time, his absence hurt me. Now, it seemed just part of the routine. Like an old piece of furniture in the house that we don't even notice anymore. That's what started to scare me. Because when love turns to indifference, the silence becomes even heavier. One Saturday afternoon, I found Lucas washing the car in front of the house. He was listening to music softly and deliberately singing the wrong lyrics, making himself laugh. When he saw me walking by, he smiled immediately. I think I just completely destroyed that song. I shook my head, laughing. Definitely. At least I was honestly criticized. We chatted there for a few minutes, long enough for me to realize something that had been growing inside me for weeks. I felt light around him. Light. It was such a simple feeling, and yet so forgotten. Lucas spoke about life with enthusiasm. About plans, trips, movies, places he still wanted to visit. He had a sparkle in his eyes when he told stories. And that reminded me of the woman I had once been. The woman who dreamed. Who laughed loudly. Who felt things intensely. Not that tired version who walked around the house, silently waiting for time to pass. That night, after I went back inside, I sat on the sofa watching the television, which was off. The house was quiet again. Too quiet. Then a question suddenly crossed my mind. When was the last time I felt alive? The question echoed inside me like a sad song. Because I didn't know the answer. Maybe the problem wasn't a lack of love. Maybe it was a lack of feeling. And admitting that brought an almost immediate guilt. I felt ungrateful. Renato had never betrayed me. He never raised his voice to me. He worked hard, paid our bills, did everything a good husband should do. So why did I feel so empty? Was the problem with him? Or with me? I spent days trying to push those thoughts away. I avoided looking out the window for too long when I heard Lucas arriving. I tried not to prolong conversations. I mentally repeated that it was just emotional neediness. But some connections stir up parts of us that have been dormant for too long. And the more I tried to ignore it, the more I realized the size of the emotional void where I had lived all those years. One early morning, I got up to get a drink of water and found Renato asleep on the sofa again, his laptop open on his chest, partially illuminating his tired face. I watched him in silence. I felt pity. I felt affection. I felt longing for what we once were. But love? At that moment, I didn't know anymore. And that was the first time I was afraid of the truth. The rain started in the late afternoon. One of those heavy, slow rains that darken the sky even before night falls. The wind whipped against the trees on the street, scattering wet leaves across the sidewalk while thunder echoed ever closer. Renato had called earlier to say he would miss his flight back because of the weather. "I'll stay another night." I read the message without surprise. Maybe a part of me already expected it. That night, the house seemed even bigger. The sound of the rain filled the empty rooms while I tried to distract myself by organizing some things in the kitchen. But there was a strange unease inside me, as if something was about to happen. And then the power went out. Everything suddenly went dark. I let out a tired sigh as I searched for my phone to use the flashlight. The rain continued to pour outside, and for a few seconds the silence of the house seemed too suffocating. That's when I heard knocking on the gate. My heart raced for no reason. I opened the front door and found Lucas completely soaked from the rain, holding a larger flashlight in his hand. "Are you okay?" he asked immediately. "I saw your light went out too." The flashlight's light partially illuminated his face, and there was such genuine concern in the way he looked at me that I felt something tighten in my chest. I think so. I think doesn't sound very convincing. I ended up laughing softly. He picked up a small toolbox. "Want me to take a look at the circuit breaker? Maybe it's just here." I hesitated for a few seconds. Maybe out of caution. Maybe because some part of me already felt that this night would be different. But in the end, I just made room for him to enter. Lucas walked through the house, illuminating the hallways while I followed him in silence. The rain beat heavily against the windows, and the distant sound of thunder made everything strangely intimate. When we reached the utility area, he examined the electrical panel. "I think water got in here. Can it be fixed?" "Yes. But it might take a while." We stood there side by side while he tried to solve the problem, improvising with a flashlight propped up on the floor. At one point, our hands accidentally touched. A quick touch, but enough to make my heart skip a beat for a few seconds. I immediately looked away. What nonsense was that? I was reacting like a teenager just because a kind man had entered my house. But maybe the problem wasn't the touch. Maybe it was the lack of it for so many years. After a few minutes, Lucas finally managed to get some of the power back on. Only a few dim lights came on in the house, creating soft shadows on the walls. "There, at least you won't have to spend the whole night in the dark." I smiled, genuinely relieved. "You just saved my sanity." "That sounds like a huge responsibility." We both laughed. And it was at that moment that something dangerous happened. The silence ceased to be uncomfortable. We stood still in the kitchen for a few seconds, listening only to the rain falling outside. The dim light made everything calmer, closer, more vulnerable. Lucas rested his hands on the counter and observed me carefully. "Can I ask you a question?" My heart tightened. "It depends." He hesitated before speaking. "Are you happy?" The question hit me brutally, because it had been a long time since anyone had asked me that. And even worse, it had been a long time since I had thought about the answer. I immediately looked away, feeling my throat dry. I think adult life makes everyone a little tired. Lucas continued to look at me in silence. He didn't seem convinced. Tired is different from sad. His words hung in the air. And suddenly I felt like crying. Not because he had said something cruel, but because he had seen something I was hiding even from myself. I slowly sat down in one of the kitchen chairs and ran my hand over my face. I don't even know when I started feeling like this anymore. My voice came out low, fragile. Lucas didn't try to get too close. He didn't try to touch me. He just stayed there, present. And maybe that's exactly what broke me down. I started talking without realizing it. About the marriage. About loneliness. About the constant feeling of invisibility in my own life. The words flowed like water that had been trapped for too long. And he listened. Truly. That night, the silence between us said much more than any words. At a certain point, I looked at Lucas and realized something frightening. I felt more understood in that dark kitchen than in years of marriage. And that's where everything changed. Not because something forbidden happened, but because, for the first time in a long time, someone really saw me. After that night, something inside me couldn't go back to the way it was before. And that scared me. In the following days, I tried to act normally. I tidied the house, answered messages, went to the market, prepared dinner as I always did. On the outside, nothing had changed. But inside, it was as if a door had been opened without me noticing. The memory of the dark kitchen, the rain, the way Lucas had looked at me while I talked about my life. All of that kept echoing in my head. Especially the question, "Are you happy?" It seemed simple, but it had dismantled entire years inside me. Renato returned from his trip 2 days later. He came home tired, talking about problems at the airport and accumulated meetings. He gave me a quick kiss on the forehead before leaving his suitcase near the stairs. "Sorry for the confusion these last few days." I smiled automatically. "It's okay." And that was precisely what hurt me. The "it's okay." Because there was never enough of a fight to justify the emptiness that existed between us. There was no betrayal, shouting, or great tragedies. Just a silent distance growing little by little until it occupied every space in the house. That night, we had dinner together almost without talking. Renato seemed exhausted. At one point, he started replying to work messages while still at his desk. I looked at him silently, and I immediately felt guilty. Guilty for comparing. Guilty for noticing differences. Guilty for feeling something awaken inside me because of another person. Lucas hadn't done anything wrong. Neither had I. But emotionally, I knew I was already crossing a dangerous line. The next day, I avoided leaving the house at the time I usually met Lucas. I closed the balcony curtains. I tried to convince myself that it was all just emotional neediness mixed with loneliness. That's all it was. It needed to be just that. But the problem with true connections is that they don't disappear because we decide to ignore them. That afternoon, I heard the familiar sound of the gate next door opening. My heart reacted before I even thought. Ridiculous. I continued organizing some clothes in the laundry room, trying to distract myself. Then I heard his voice coming from the low wall that separated our houses. "Helena?" I closed my eyes for a second before answering. "Hi." Lucas appeared on the other side, holding a small plant in a simple pot. "I bought some seedlings today and remembered you like these balcony flowers." I smiled involuntarily. It was so small, so simple, but it made my chest tighten in a dangerous way. "You didn't need to." "I know." Silence followed. Not uncomfortable, just heavy. Lucas seemed to want to say something, but hesitated. "You disappeared these past few days." My heart raced. I immediately looked away. I was just busy. He observed me for a few seconds in silence, and then asked, with a calmness that almost disarmed me, "Are you running away from me?" The question hit too hard. Because maybe I was. But not from him. From myself. I took a deep breath before answering. "I think I'm trying to organize my thoughts." Lucas nodded slowly, without pressure. "I understand." But I had the feeling he understood too well. I distractedly fiddled with the plant's leaves while the cold afternoon wind swayed the trees on the street. My chest was heavy. "All of this is confusing me. I admitted softly. He hesitated for a few seconds before speaking. Helena, I never wanted to interfere in your life. The sincerity in his voice made everything worse. Because it would be easier if Lucas were irresponsible, or intrusive, or disrespectful. But he wasn't. And perhaps that's why my guilt grew even more. You didn't do anything, I replied almost in a whisper. The problem is, I started noticing things I'd been trying to ignore for a long time. He didn't answer immediately. He just stood there, looking at me with that quiet attention that dismantled all my defenses. And it was at that moment that I realized a difficult truth. I didn't just miss romance. I missed connection, presence, being heard, feeling important to someone. I spent so much time surviving emotionally within my marriage that I almost forgot what it was like to feel alive near another person. That night, Renato went to bed early again. The laptop was open beside the bed, partially illuminating his tired face. I watched in silence, and I hated myself for comparing the two. Renato represented stability, history, security, years built together. Lucas represented something much more dangerous, the possibility of feeling again. I sat alone in the dark room hours later, hugging my legs on the sofa as the light rain began again outside. I no longer knew if I was running from loneliness or chasing after myself. And perhaps that was the most painful part of all. Because, deep down, I was beginning to realize that my marriage wasn't falling apart because of Lucas. Lucas only illuminated cracks that had existed for a long time. But admitting this meant facing questions I had been avoiding for years. Was there still love between me and Renato? Or just habit? To what extent can loneliness transform a person? And when did I stop recognizing the woman who existed within me? That early morning, I watched the rain fall outside the window while the whole world seemed too silent. And, for the first time in a long time, I was afraid of what my heart truly wanted. The hardest truths don't arrive all at once. They appear slowly, silently, like small cracks in a wall that we pretend not to see until we realize the entire structure is already compromised. After that conversation with Lucas by the wall of the house, I started to avoid lying to myself. And that hurt more than any guilt. I spent years saying that my marriage was just going through a difficult phase. That Renato's job demanded a lot. That long marriages do cool down. That loving someone also meant learning to accept absences. But, deep down, I knew that something much deeper was happening. We had both stopped seeing each other a long time ago. There was still affection, respect, partnership, but it seemed that the most vibrant part of our relationship had gradually disappeared without us realizing it. And perhaps the saddest thing is precisely that. Some loves don't end in an explosion. They end in silence. One Thursday night, Renato arrived home earlier than usual. I found it strange. He seemed tired, but there was something different in his eyes too, as if he were carrying thoughts that were too heavy. We had dinner together almost in silence until, suddenly, he asked, "Are you happy, Helena?" My heart stopped for a second. The same question, almost the same words. I looked at him, unable to answer immediately. Renato ran a hand over his face, sighing deeply. "I know I've been absent more than I should be." That sentence broke me down because, for the first time in a long time, I felt he was really looking at me. But I also realized something else painful. Maybe we were trying to wake up too late. Nothing inside me was ever the same again. And what if I told you that the most dangerous moment of this whole story wasn't when everything started to change, but when I realized I had already changed a long time ago? Because the truth is that nobody wakes up one day simply lost. We get lost little by little. In small silences. In conversations that don't happen. In hugs that cease to exist. In glances that no longer meet. And when you realize it, you're already too far from yourself. Today, looking back at everything I've been through, I can understand more clearly what I previously only felt as confusion. I wasn't living a forbidden romance. I was living an old emptiness. an emptiness that already existed within my marriage long before any new person appeared in my life. For a long time, I believed the problem was the absence of major bad events. After all, there was no betrayal, no shouting, no disrespect. But I discovered something much deeper than that. The absence of presence also hurts. The worst kind of loneliness isn't being alone. It's feeling alone next to someone who should see you. I remember entire nights when I was in the same house as Renato, but emotionally miles away from him. I remember silent dinners, conversations that died halfway through, small attempts at connection that were never truly answered. And, for a long time, I thought this was normal. That marriages were just like that. That adult life was just like that. That I needed to get used to it. But no one should get used to being invisible. Neediness doesn't spring from one night. It springs from years of not truly being seen. And when someone finally sees you again, even if just for a moment, it's not magic. It's just your heart remembering what it's like to exist. Lucas wasn't a savior. He didn't come to change my life. He came to remind me of something I had forgotten. I still existed. I still felt. I still dreamed. I still needed to be heard. But this also came with an emotional price that I had to learn to bear. Because when you wake up inside, you can't go back to sleep. And that's scary. It's scary to realize that maybe you've lived years on autopilot. It's scary to look at the person you've become. It's scary to question decisions that seemed safe. But, above all, it's scary to realize that change hurts, even when it's necessary. I don't have perfect answers for what's right or wrong in this story. I no longer believe in easy answers. What I've learned is that feelings aren't simple. They don't follow clear rules. They don't respect perfect structures. And ignoring what we feel for fear of consequences is also a way of disappearing. Today I understand that it's not about blaming anyone. Not Renato. Not Lucas. Not myself. It's about seeing the truth I avoided for so long. I was emotionally alone long before I realized it. And maybe you, listening to me now, have felt something similar. Maybe you've wondered why, even having everything, you still feel empty inside. If that's crossed your mind, then you understand exactly what I'm talking about. And the question that remains isn't about the past. It's about what we do after seeing the truth. Do we pretend nothing happened? Or do we finally start choosing ourselves too? Because in the end, the biggest lesson this story left me with was simple, but painful. There's no healthy love where you cease to exist in order to be seen.